this. And we talked yesterday about cultural inclusivity. I think we ought to always be mindful that our job isn't necessarily to try to represent every single culture in our classroom because we think that's what kids need or what kids want. This gives you an opportunity to really, at the very beginning of the year, hear from kids and find out how they identify. What are the things that they relate to and connect to? I get a lot of answers, especially to this final question, what's most personally relevant. This particular event, because I am a Black woman, because I am a part of the LGBTQ community, because I am Asian American. And in doing that, I can see what kind of things the students value, how they view their own identity. Helps you to get to know your students a little better, but also helps them to connect upfront with the mission and the work of the discipline of psychology. Now, honestly, too, it's not perfect. Some kids, like with any activity, just breeze through and find little short things. I have found one thing that's pretty common. There's a lot of academic stuff on there, like AP exam, I think is mentioned on there. Also, I think there are a few TOPS related things there. National High School Psychology Standards. Some kids will pull those things out as the most relevant because I'm in a high school psychology class. But that is just one thing I wanted to share with you that you can use up front at the very beginning of the year that's kind of helpful in working towards increasing representation, but then also seeing where your students are coming from. Melissa?
Yeah. All right, so we're just working our way through the units in order, just because that was a really easy way for us to organize and present this to you. And so I have this in Scientific Foundations. It really can be anywhere. It's just this particular activity that I got from the lovely Amy Ramponi is dealing with scientific foundations. But I wanted to highlight the in brief portion of the APA Monitor, where you guys can go and look for different research studies that are new and that allow for us to be able to highlight different people groups. So if you're noticing that the research that you're using is predominantly white, it's dealing with cisgender people, it's dealing with those who are identifying as heterosexual, you can come here and see what research maybe is more recent that you can bring in some of that diversity into your classroom. So it doesn't have to be a standalone activity like I have on here that's linked. I'll show you in which different snippets can be analyzed as to what perspective in psychology is being demonstrated here. You can just use it as an example in your lecture. So it doesn't have to be something that you are just doing as a one-time thing, but you're weaving it throughout your lectures, throughout your curriculum. So students are seeing examples of updated research where they can see aspects of who they are represented in these particular studies. I think that's all I have to say about that one there. So kind of a quick one.
All right. Like I said, we're going to be bouncing back and forth with the screen share. So hopefully that's not too discombobulating. So that takes us through scientific foundations and a couple of ways to deal with issues of race, sex, and gender. I think it's helpful to see too that, this isn't always something we worry, and Melissa even mentioned yesterday with new laws. I think a lot of us worry about how and when we bring these things up, what are the repercussions going to be? What are the reactions going to be? I think these are some safer ways to do that. Of course, we have some links on the right. In the learning unit, we really don't have anything to present to you with that, but we do have a link here on the right. I think that's a little exercise or activity that Melissa included. I think that one came from Rob McIntyre.
Yes. Yeah, and I can talk about that one really quick. Just because in the learning unit, you can connect so much to why racism exists. And so you can have your students determine, like, how can you explain why racism is a thing through anything in this unit? So they can connect it to classical conditioning, operant conditioning, observational learning. There isn't a wrong answer with it. And so they can understand While this is not something we want in our society, it does exist, and we need to understand that and possibly use those same principles to work to reduce it.
All right. So moving on, in cognitive psychology, there are a couple of things that we're going to share with you. So this link here, eyewitness memory and race. I'm going to see if, Melissa, did my screen just change? Are you able to see?
You're still on our doc.
Okay. I'm going to have to stop share then and redo that. So a little exercise you can use in cognitive psychology. This is something that I think a lot of people I think are most likely familiar with this, but you may use it a little differently. There's an old classic 60 Minutes clip about an individual named Ronald Cotton who was falsely, imprisoned due to eyewitness testimony and DNA evidence exonerated him after a number of years spent in jail. If you do use this video clip, though, I think it's important to recognize it is quite old, and especially in our modern era when we think about police reform and things like that, a lot of bad things happened that are presented in that case that that have changed. So I think it's important to note that and recognize that. But the way I use this assignment is to start out with this question: if you were the victim of a violent crime, how well do you think you would remember details about your attacker? And just have students explain up front with, without a whole lot of detail of where we're going with this. And there are a few students that recognize, like, I'm not going to remember much, or my memory is not going to be terribly reliable. Now, this video clip is, it's not a graphic video clip, but it does contain, well, it's an explanation, it's a recap of sexual assault. So I think that's important to be clear about up front with students. But I do warn them about that a little bit, and we watch the video, and this is, I'm not going to play it, but this is what you're looking at. And then this is from my Myers textbook. After we watch that, and I'm sure most textbooks have a similar section, just 2 or 3 pages usually. And I have students go in and look up and look at these terms, and not just write a definition, but actually kind of give an explanation. We saw this clip, we saw how the person's eyewitness memory, what she thought she remembered, was flawed. And the video doesn't mention any of these particular terms, but they're definitely there. So it's a little bit higher order, having students kind of apply what they've got. And typically, Elizabeth Loftus is going to be mentioned in this section. Now, in the first video clip, I don't think that there's any Elizabeth Loftus in there. She is featured in the second part. So, Melissa, I'm noticing that things are popping up in the chat, but I'm not really paying attention.
I'm on it.
You want to? Okay,
I got it.
We can kind of take turns monitoring that and speak up if something happens. Okay, so second part of this, your turn. We're going to watch a security video recording of a crime taking place. Now, in the second part of the video, they actually do this. I don't usually show the second half of the video, honestly. Lately, I've been cutting that part out, but you can watch the second part of the video if you care to. But this link here, this is actually in the video. I'll just hit play on this. I don't know how well you can see it, but it's just grainy video footage of somebody. You can tell them ahead of time a guy's going to be planting a bomb on the roof of a building. You need to make sure that you look closely and get a good look at the guy. I think that part's coming up here in just a minute. Yeah, you got to get a good look at this guy. He's going to look up and then run out of the room. No need for us to watch the whole thing. But after I show them that, I have them all one by one look at a lineup. Now the lineup is online too. That's the first link related to this video. I'm not going to click that. It'll take too long to load, but you can see from the thumbnail here. They just go through 1 through 6. Students have to pick somebody. The kicker to this is there's nobody in the lineup who is the guy's not in the lineup. Basically, that's the kicker, and that leads to a lot of conversation. Some students kind of get it and they're like, I don't know if there's anybody there, but most students will pick somebody, and you can really kind of talk about how they felt forced to pick somebody. Sometimes they say, well, it's a setup because the person wasn't really there. But, when we come to think that somebody did something, they may not have done that thing, but we still judge them as if they did. And of course, here's some wrap up for the second half of the story. So I do want to just say one more time before I move on from this. It's an older video. There's one quote in this video that speaks to me a lot. A police officer that's interviewed in the video says, now we know that memory is like a crime scene and you have to protect it. So I do think in some ways that's a good opportunity to talk about how psychology has influenced a lot of the way law enforcement works and how things are different today than some of the things that we saw in the in that video and in that particular case. So one other quick thing that I'm going to share, and then we'll switch back over to Melissa. I'm going to exit my tabs as I go. One thing that I did this year, especially in times of COVID, were podcasts. And I would usually, we were, I'm trying to find a good place to put this. We were usually this year really lucky. We had 4 days. We were talking about this before the session. We only went to school 4 days synchronously and in person when we went this year. And Fridays were meant to be asynchronous for students, and we were, we were in meetings and stuff. So I would actually leave these podcasts as a not a suggestion, but as an assignment for a student. But along with it, I would tell them things like, take a walk and listen to this, put your headphones in, or make your parents happy and clean your room and play it in the background while you're cleaning your room. And the questions that I would ask about them were always very open-ended sort of response questions. What's one thing you learned from this? What's something you found surprising? What's the most significant part of this story? So this is one that I use that relates to IQ. I'm going to go back on this tab for just a minute, if I can. It's a Radiolab series called G, and they're all very good. I don't know that you could, I don't know that most of us could have our students listen to 6 specific podcasts. Actually, I haven't heard this one. You see, they all came out in 2019. This one is new. But I find this one, The Miseducation of Larry P., to be one of the more relatable ones. Some of the students, the feedback they give on this isn't quite what I'm looking for, but it's not so much a deep new understanding of IQ and IQ testing and its role in race. But they'll say this was such a good story. I like the way they started at the end and kind of kept you engaged through the whole thing. So Melissa has a couple of things to share that are related to that.
All right, so this is an activity that I compiled from something that Amy had put together and something Virginia Welly had put together, and they were really along the same vein of really mistreatment of Black individuals for IQ purposes. So whether they were discriminated against and not given special education services, or they were put on death row and they didn't have a high enough IQ that it was really considered that they knew the ramifications of what it is that they were doing. So I combined them because I wanted my students to have exposure to both of these stories, but I didn't want them to have to do both of the work. So I put this together in a hyperslide format. So that they're really only looking at one of the particular stories, and then they're also applying different scenarios, or sorry, different terms from our particular unit to the particular story that they are engaging with. So it's not just a matter of listen to this story and hear what's going on here, but what are the terms that you can apply from your learning to bring this back? And then I also have ways in which they can extend their learning, especially when it comes to Black men who have been falsely accused of things. They are being imprisoned, put on death row, different things, especially like the Innocence and the Marshall Projects, as to advocating for those individuals and getting them the proper representation and getting them accountable only for the things that they've done, not having them be punished for things that they didn't do. They come back together, the two partners in this particular scenario, they come back together and they tell the other person about what it is that they encountered, how that relates to the different terms within our unit. Or I have them challenge each other. And, after they tell, I read about Marvin Wilson, they tell that to their partner, and then they encourage their partner to apply the terms that the person who actually engaged with the Marvin's story actually did. So it really can be a matter of challenging both sets of students, even though they're only engaging with one of the stories, but they're still getting the learning for both. I did also want to highlight, because this is a graph that does show up pretty often within psychology textbooks, that we do see a difference in intelligence when it comes to the different races, but that it needs to be specified that these differences are not due to genetics. They are due to environmental factors. And if there is anything in genetics, it is still due to environmental factors impacting genetics. So it's very important to point out to students that we don't have differences between the races when it comes to intelligence because of who they are biologically. It's because of the environment that we set up, giving people access to, sorry.
Is it confusing?
Say that again? No? Okay.
I'm just going to remind everybody, Melissa, real quick, if you could make sure that you're muted so that we don't hear your background noise, that would be great.
Thank you. It's because of giving people equal access to education, to nutrition, any of those things. We are not providing the same equality to different people groups. That's what impacts these differences between groups. So it's important to point that out so that they aren't thinking that there's something inherently different about people groups when it comes to intelligence.
Melissa, could I add?
Absolutely.
I just want to point out the particular graph that that Melissa has up there. I use that as well, and I get a little worried each year, putting this up and showing it. I think it's important because I know that I have enough students, particularly my my white academic male students that frequently kind of connect with Jordan Peterson type stuff, or even worse, will sometimes end up down the rabbit hole. Of course, here in Charlottesville, several years ago, we had a lot of exposure to Richard Spencer and that sort of stuff. I just know that I'm going to have students that are going to see this in a quasi-academic framework. And I feel that it's really important to share this because I think they need to have the tools to actually recognize what they're seeing. One thing I do with this is before we even get to this part, Melissa had already mentioned, when we think about heritability and things like that, the difference between groups is much more likely to be environmental than genetic. I draw a little fake Flynn, a little diagram of the Flynn effect, and I'll use different color markers and conceptually, Flynn showed that IQs of my generation, are here and will overlap a bell curve with a later generation. And a later generation, and point out to kids that this graph that I just drew of the Flynn effect looks a whole lot like this this graph that's representing racial differences. Does there seem to be any genetic explanation for why my children are likely to have higher IQ than my generation? And we all recognize that's kind of ridiculous. And even thinking back to what we teach about stuff like correlation and causation, right? Sometimes the surface data seems to tell us something, but you really have to look deeper and understand what you're talking about.
All right, I'm going to move on to talking about biological sex. This is one of my favorite things to talk about with my students, because it tends to be that even if my students understand that gender itself isn't binary, they might not have heard about different aspects of biological sex that aren't binary. And it also helps maybe convince those students who think that gender is binary and sex is binary, that it isn't actually. So we talk about intersex individuals and the different variations that we see when it comes to biological sex. And so we talk about intersex being an individual who has genitals that are suggestive of both sexes, both male and female. We talk about androgen insensitivity syndrome, in which someone is they're male while they are developing in utero, but they don't respond to those particular male sex hormones. So they don't end up developing male genitals. And so when they are born, physically they look female, but their genetics show that they have XY chromosomes. We also talk about some ones that they are definitely not familiar with. If anything, they're familiar with intersex. Maybe they've heard of androgen insensitivity syndrome, but they haven't heard of Turner or Klinefelter syndrome. And this is where it really gets interesting for them, because they don't realize that we don't just have individuals with XX and XY. With Turner syndrome, you have one sex chromosome, just X, that's it. And so these are going to be individuals who I believe physically demonstrate as female. They definitely have some possible health risks that go along with that, with issues with their heart. They might also have some physical features that show up that would allow for someone to be able to identify that there is something physically different about them. And then we also talk about Klinefelter syndrome. And this is an individual who has 3 sex chromosomes, so X, X, and Y. And that one gets really difficult for them because they have an X and a Y. So we would determine that to be male, but at the same time, they have 2 X's and we would determine that to be female. So that's really difficult for them to wrap their head around. But that is considered to be someone who is male with an extra female chromosome. And we talk about the differences physically for that individual, that they would have abnormal testes, they would be infertile, they wouldn't be able to produce sperm, but they also have enlarged breasts. They also have an increased risk of breast cancer. And so I really just like presenting that information to them because they don't tend to know about this. And it really challenges what they think they understand, obviously about biological sex, but then that can transfer over to gender, even though those are 2 vastly different things. It can be a lot of times that because they think that biological sex is binary, they can think that gender is binary. So this really challenges some of those preconceived notions my students have. All right, and then definitely different. Let me get through to my slides here. Sexual orientation obviously is different because this is talking about someone's enduring emotional, romantic, and sexual attraction to others, which is definitely not the same as gender and definitely not the same as biological sex. We do talk about what we've covered yesterday in that homosexuality used to be considered a psychological disorder in the DSM and how that was removed. We do also talk about things like conversion therapy and chemical castration because I want them to be aware that not only are these things that existed in what we thought was treatment, but there are some states in which these things are still considered to be appropriate treatments for this. And then we also talk about the biological basis of sexual orientation. And I do want to reference this book here. Let's make sure we can see this. Oh, it's not showing up.
I think it's
there it goes.
blurring with your
Yeah.
background.
Controversy in the Psychology Classroom. Dana Dunn Regan, who's going to be speaking to us later this morning. I highly recommend it. The chapter that I'm talking about here was written by one of my favorites, Dr. Dave Myers. Sexual orientation, marriage, and students of faith. And so he does take this from the background of being someone who is of the Christian faith, and he makes a significant case for gay marriage. And what he talks about are specifically prenatal influences on sexual orientation. We do have, let's see, when was this study done? they did do a study in which they did autopsies on individuals. So men who identified as straight, men who identified as gay, and then women. And what they found was that there was a better correlation between men who identified as gay and women in the size of their hypothalamus. Another thing he talks about is the genetic connection when it comes to twins. So if you have an identical twin who identifies as gay, there's a 52% chance the other identical twin will as well. And that drops to 22% when it's fraternal twins. So likely there's some sort of genetic connection there. And he talks about what is called the fraternal birth order effect, which they can't really explain. But the idea is that the more older brothers one has, the more likely those younger brothers will identify as gay. So, he says in here, the odds of homosexuality are roughly 2% among first sons, 3% for second sons, 4% for third sons, and so on and so forth for each additional older brother. And they're not quite sure what this means or why this is, but they suspect that there is some sort of defensive maternal immune response to foreign substances produced by male fetuses. So with each pregnancy with a male fetus, maternal antibodies may become stronger and may prevent their brain from developing in a male typical pattern. So this might be something that can explain that biological basis of sexual orientation. I also like to not only represent different races in all of my slides, but I also like to show different sexual orientations here. So you have individuals who are gay, bisexual, pansexual, and asexual, just to give them a good representation of individuals who are out there. And I do also like to try to make it so that they are healthy relationships, because a lot of times maybe people will say, oh, well, that's not a very good relationship. And that is somehow stereotypical of all people who are gay or lesbian or pansexual or anything like that. I want to show them healthy relationships because they absolutely do exist. And I like to challenge those stereotypes that they might hold.
Could I say, just to tag along with that, though, one thing I found interesting in the book recommendations that you guys put up earlier, the book Behave came up a few times, and I have usually I like to get through books fast and plug through them. I started reading this one 3 or 4 months ago, and I've kind of intentionally been moving a little slow. But hearing what you were saying, Melissa, about the biology of this, he has a section where he talks about PTSD in soldiers and how once brain imaging and brain scans kind of validated the concept of PTSD, it was taken more seriously by legislation in Congress and things like that. And he was a bit dismissive that why should it take this, why should it take a physical manifestation of brain changes or differences for us to recognize what everybody can see. People come back from wars and they suffer psychological distress. And I think it's important when you mentioned the Klinefelters and Turners, for a lot of people, that becomes the validation for them. It's like, oh, maybe things aren't the way that I think. But it is kind of unfortunate that we can't just observe and understand people's lived experience without somehow searching for the proof through biology.
Absolutely.
Did you want to move on to the other, or you want to flip over to me?
You want to go ahead and do the Just World demonstration?
Sure, let's do that. And then we can pop back.
Yeah.
Depending on time. So we're going to try to do something with you guys real quick. This is, real live workshop. We could be handing stuff out and moving around and getting in groups and doing things like that. So what I'm about to do with you guys, a lot of you are familiar with. I think some of you may have even done before, but most of you do it slightly different than the way I do it. So I'm just going to kind of start from this point moving forward and do with you mostly what I would do with my students in a class, okay? So as we talk about prejudice in our society, in our world, I look at social factors, cognitive factors, and and other things that lead to prejudice, attitudes, and behavior. And I like to start with social inequalities. And I asked you, social inequalities I explain this way. Basically haves and have-nots. When there is one group that has greater access to or opportunity to relative to another group in that society, we would consider it a social inequality. And I asked students, could you name some characteristics in the United States where we can witness and see social inequalities? What are some of those characteristics? Why don't you guys drop some terms in the chat and see what we come up with? What are some of the characteristics of people that we observe that lead to social inequalities in our society? Age, economic, race, gender, income, age, socioeconomic, sex, gender, race, access to education, what people wear, ability, political affiliation, yeah, religion. Please repeat the question. What are some characteristics around which we observe social inequalities in our society? So we get this, and these are some of the similar things that students bring up. Height, I see height on there. So sometimes when it's an easy one like that, you point out, like if you look at CEOs, particularly male CEOs in companies, and the height differentiation between them and the average male. I'll use the religion as an example. I ask students, obviously a voluntary response, but do you identify as Christian? And in our context, most students will raise their hands, and I'll ask them, what's your most important holiday? And it's always Easter, Christmas, and I ask when they've ever had to rearrange their life or make up work or different arrangements to observe their most religious holy days, and obviously not. And I ask to compare that to our Jewish friends, our Muslim friends, and I even give them a little safety there, like, you could argue that it's okay. It only makes sense. It's the majority. We can't, but even if you acknowledge that, you can't deny that there's an inequality, that one group of people has less privilege and more difficulty than another. In the past, I really liked, and well, I'm glad that I can't anymore, but the example used to be gay marriage. Whether you believe that people should be gay or not gay, there are gay people. And because of that, at the time, they could not get married. That's a social inequality. Today, of course, I haven't really used this in the classroom as much, but I think we have the same sort of issues around transgender, things that we talked about yesterday, bathrooms, participation in things. So we really try to structure and frame the idea of a social inequality, and I try to turn it into something. I try to keep the emotion down and keep the opinion down, because it's not really an opinion issue. Whether you believe they should be or shouldn't be, whether you think they're good or bad, right or wrong or whatever, it's objective that we have differentiation between the amount of privilege and opportunity that people have based on those characteristics. I just wanted to acknowledge that. So step 2, I'm going to all right, let me do a little multitasking. I'm sorry. Okay, I'm gonna have to ask for your grace for just a minute, and give me 1 second to find and open something. Okay, I'm all good. I think I'm all good. All right, I'm gonna paste a link in the chat. If you guys could all open that, it should open a form, and you should have the ability to fill out that form. I'm gonna pause for just a second or two, and if you have any problems, let me know. Okay. So again, this is an activity some of you guys use. Some of you may have never heard of it before, but what I do is a little different. So I'm just going to do it with you. I'm going to read a story to you. And my eyes aren't on the Zoom screen right now because I'm getting ready to read something. So if something goes wrong, somebody speak up and let me know. I'm going to read a story to you. And at the end of that story, you're going to answer a question that's really kind of a judgment question about this story. Okay? So here we go. Once upon a time, a husband and wife lived together in a part of the city separated by a river from the places of employment, shopping, and entertainment. The husband had to work nights. Each evening, he left his wife and took the ferry boat to work, returning in the morning. His wife soon grew tired of this arrangement. Restless and lonely, she would take the next ferry into town each evening and develop relationships with a series of lovers. Anxious to preserve her marriage, she always returned home before her husband. In fact, her relationships were always limited. When they threatened to become too intense, she would precipitate a quarrel with her current lover and begin a new relationship. One night, she caused such a fight with a man we will call lover number one. He slammed the door in her face and she started back to the ferry. Suddenly, she realized that she had forgotten to bring the money for her return fare. She swallowed her pride and returned to lover number one's apartment to borrow the fare. After all, she had to get home before her husband. Lover number one was vindictive and angry because of the fight. He slammed the door on his former lover, leaving her with no money. She remembered a previous lover, who we shall call lover number two, who lived just a few doors away. Surely he would give her the ferry boat fare. However, lover number two was still so hurt from their old fight that he too refused to give her the money. Now the hour was getting late and the woman was getting desperate. She rushed down to the ferry boat and pleaded with the ferry boat captain. He knew her as a regular customer. She asked if he could let her ride free and if she could pay the next night. But the captain insisted that rules were rules and that he could not let her ride without paying the fare. Dawn would soon be breaking and her husband would be returning from work. The woman remembered that there was a free bridge about a mile further on, but the road to the bridge was a dangerous one, known to be frequented by dangerous individuals. Nonetheless, she had to get home before her husband, so she took the road. On the way, a thief stepped out of the bushes and demanded her money. She told him she had none. He seized her, and in the ensuing fight, the thief stabbed the woman and she died. This is the end of our story. Now, if you have opened the form, please take a minute to respond to the question, most responsible and least responsible, and then click next. And I'll give you just a minute or two to make that choice and click next. Don't submit anything yet, because if you click next, we're going to have one other story and you're going to have a different set of questions for this second story. Let's see, a couple people have submitted. Not a problem, because honestly, I don't know what we're going to get out of this. Every time I do this with students, I don't know what I'm going to get out of them. And I'm nervous every time, but with students, it's always the same for me. I don't know if it will be for you or not. I'm going to read story number 2. And after I read story number 2, the second section of the form will have similar directions. You can respond to that and submit. Story number 2, second section of your form. Once upon a time, a widow and her children lived together in a part of the city separated by a river from the places of employment, shopping, and entertainment. The widow had to work nights to support a family. Each evening, a sitter would come to watch the children, and she would take the ferry to work, returning in the morning. Her sitter couldn't stay any later than 5 a.m. to watch the children, and the widow found it difficult to keep the job because she often had to leave early to relieve the sitter. Her relationship with some of her previous employers was strained because of this. One night, she argued with her employer because of having to leave work in time to get her children. The boss became angry and fired her, sending her away. On her way to the ferry, she realized that she had forgotten the money for the return fare. She swallowed her pride and returned to her boss, but the man was vindictive and angry, so he refused to give her any money. She remembered a previous boss who managed a store several blocks away. Surely he would give her the money. But he was still angry over the circumstances of her departure and refused her the money. Now the hour began to get late and the widow was getting desperate. She rushed down to the ferry and pleaded with the ferry boat captain. He knew her as a regular customer. She asked if he could let her ride free and if she could pay the next night. But the captain insisted that rules were rules and he could not let her ride without paying the fare. Dawn would soon be breaking and her sitter would have to leave the children alone. The widow remembered a free bridge about a mile further on, but the road to the bridge was a dangerous one, known to be frequented by dangerous people. Nonetheless, she had to get home, so she took the road. On the way, a thief stepped out of the bushes and demanded her money. She told him she had none. He seized her, and in the ensuing fight, the thief stabbed the widow, and she died. That is the end of the second story. If you would go ahead and complete the form, the second section of the form, and hit submit when you are finished. And let's get a good few. I've got 18 responses. Keep the responses coming. We'll move on in just a second. Now, I think if that's familiar to you, if that's an exercise that you've done before, I think a lot of people split the class into two and maybe maybe give one story to one group, one story to the other group. I'm going to share my screen with you and we'll take a look at the results that we're getting. Now, I will just say this up front. In the story, one person stabbed another person. They put a knife into them and killed them. So there is one most responsible person, regardless of which story you heard. It's the person who put a knife into another person and killed them. So these are our adult responses here. In the first story, who is most responsible? 80% feel like the robber was most responsible. In the second story, it looks like 85% think that the robber is most responsible. So for some reason, collectively as a group, we have assigned less responsibility to the thief or the robber who happened to kill a cheating wife than we would assign to the one who happened to kill a responsible widow trying to take care of her children. So I put this up here just because I thought, I really don't think if we do this with a bunch of grown-ups that we're going to get that same response. This is what I got from my students in class this year. In the first story with the cheating wife, about 52% gave the thief the majority of the responsibility, but more of them held the robber responsible in the second story. All right, so let's just see if we still get these results. 80% of you think the robber, the thief, was most responsible for the killing of the wife, but 85% think that the robber was most responsible for killing the widow. Let's see who's least responsible. So it looks like we got a lot of generosity for the husband here as least responsible. Oh goodness, we're mixed over here. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing there for a minute. So yeah, somebody I see. So this link to exactly what I did is going to be in the resources that we give you. I've got a copy of the form that I've used if you want to access that and use it that way as well. Let me show you this real quick too. I also have a copy of both stories with a set of directions that explain the procedure that I just did. Also, oftentimes in the classroom, I'll go up to the board like this, and I'll just have students with a show of hands. We'll go through each of these and put it on the screen. But this is an example of the just world phenomena, blaming the victim. So back to the social inequalities, right? If I believe that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, if I believe in a just world, if I believe that a murderer is less responsible for killing someone who deserves to be killed than for killing somebody who doesn't deserve to be killed, how does that link back to our social inequalities? Again, it doesn't matter what your morality is or if you think things are right or wrong or whatever. We've already identified that people exist and live with particular characteristics, and that these inequalities exist. And if what we just saw with the just world phenomena, what we just saw that we are collective. It doesn't matter about the individuals. We're a group of 112 people here, and collectively we decided that that the widow's life was more valuable than the wife's. How does that lead us to a bigger bigger understanding of our world? Sejal says the discussion often goes to victim blaming in rape cases, and oftentimes I'll bring that up. If you were a lawyer defending a nice young college student, college male that had been accused of sexual assault or rape, what's the best defense that you can give him? And we all know the answer is demean the victim. If the victim is of less quality, then we don't care as much. So I'm going to pitch it back over to you, Melissa.
I did want to highlight in the chat, Brenda brought up that she also has students focus on the fact that Black men are being shot by police, and that's also an example of blaming the victim. And that was definitely a focus that my students took this year when we had our discussion about the activity afterward. Yeah, absolutely. The idea is they should have just done what they were told. That's the supposed argument. All right.
The other more relevant one I'm seeing in the chat, guys, is about COVID vaccinations and getting COVID, right? Like a lot of, I mean, there's multiple reasons for why some people aren't vaccinated, and to just jump to, well, they should have just gotten vaccinated, right? And so they deserve to get COVID if they didn't do what they were told to do.
So Melissa, I'm gonna just, if you want to go through, if you want to take a look at the what we have on the document and see what else is there that you'd like to share and present, and then if you get through that, we could throw it out for questions.
Let's just talk about the miscellaneous part, because I think the other one has a good write-up.
Okay.
So we could do that. All right. So at the beginning of the school year, a way for me to honor my students in their diversity is to have them introduce themselves to me. And this tends to work better either if it's a one-on-one conversation, because I've got my other students working on something else, or they can do it in a digital form. I've got Flipgrid linked there. They can introduce themselves. You can get their pronunciation of their name, and you can have that as a video, so you can go back and listen to it again and again and again to make sure that you are getting that pronunciation correctly, so that you are identifying your students by the way in which they do identify themselves. And it also can give them the opportunity, if they would like to identify their pronouns, that they have the ability to do that. And if you wanted to even model this and put your own video out there, here's my name, here are my pronouns. It gives them maybe that safety net to be able to convey that to you. And so it's not something that every student in class has to see. Like, you can make it so that it's private and you as the teacher are the only one having that there to your access. But it allows for your students to be able to communicate to you how they identify, so that you have the ability to respect that. I know sometimes teachers are concerned with getting the pronunciations wrong for their student names. Maybe sometimes they don't try, but that's really a microaggression, because we should be trying, making sure that we're not just using our own version of how we pronounce their name. It's their name. Their identity is a huge part of who they are. And honoring that is a really valuable thing in building those relationships like we've been talking about. I did also want to highlight the language that we use, especially because we are in a psychology classroom, to try to model for our students to not use terms like crazy and psycho, because then it just makes it okay for everybody else to do that. And it demeans those who have a psychological disorder, because when we're talking about inclusivity, it's not just about race, it's not just about gender, it's also about mental health. It's about your physical abilities, so many different things. One of my friends told me about a podcast, and I'll have to see if I can go and find it. And the person uses the term banana pants instead of crazy, just as a way to get that completely away from psychological disorders and really just using those terms as negative identifiers. And I think we can have people take time for that self-reflection tool if you think, Stephen.
If you would like, did you get, there was a message from Sejal.
Nope, what you got?
Yeah, so they wanted to give a little time for break before Reagan. So do you want to do that, or do you just want to see if folks have
then let me just mention the self-reflection tool. So this is put out by the APA, and it allows for you to be able to evaluate where you are in that inclusivity with diversity in your classroom. So yeah, there are probably going to be things that you are doing well, and we need to highlight that so that you continue to do those things. But where else can you grow in meeting those particular aspects within your classroom? So feel free to take this. This was something that was put together because of the APA Summit in 2017. So use this and see where you can grow in your classroom practice.